Welcome to another Street Entrepreneurs Workshop. Um, Today, we will be discussing thinking like a CEO. I really believe that leadership is not something you are, but rather it's something you do. And the title of CEO does not necessarily make you a leader or help you think like one. And it is rather a transformation. It is also a little bit different to be a founder because you're given that title pretty quickly. A lot of times people grow in their careers into the title of CEO, but when you become a founder, you are all of a sudden elevated to the leadership of your company, even if that company is just one. I also want to take a minute to acknowledge before we begin that we are living in unprecedented times, and leadership is particularly difficult. People are losing loved ones. People are getting sick, and in essence, it's no different than it perhaps was before. But at least we had the illusion of stability. I myself have recently lost my beloved uncle, and it's hard. But I'm here with you today because I know that we're left, and you have to move on. And I believe that unlike every other positions in a company, when you are founder and CEO, you don't get to quit. If you're a consultant, you get to call off the engagement, the EVOV. If you are an employee, you get to put in a resignation. If you're a funder, you get to withdraw. But if you are a founder and CEO, you have to move on. So without further ado, John, I welcome you. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share your PowerPoint and let you begin whenever you like.
Sure.
I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions via Facebook, via YouTube, and via Twitter through the messaging options, and we will be reading them out loud at the end. If you're live with us on the studio, you can ask questions yourself. So simply go ahead and let us know in the private chat that you're interested in asking a question, and we will add you to the live stream. John, feel free to take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you for having me here today. As Juliana mentioned, our topic today is Think Like a CEO. And I just want to tell you a little bit about who I am, why you should listen to me at all. My name's John Seiffer. I have been an entrepreneur for all of my adult life, really. I've never had a job, and I've actually had companies the whole time. It's kind of like a disease, I think, at this point. But 25 years ago, mid-90s sometime, I started coaching and consulting with other CEOs and other business owners like myself. And over that time of working with so many different companies, I've developed a process for thinking of companies as a combination of systems, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. If you'd like a copy of this deck, feel free to email me, john@ceobootcamp.com. That's my consulting practice, and I'll have that up at the end as well. A little bit about how to take notes. You don't have to write down what you're seeing or hearing, because if you want, I can send you this deck. What you should write down is some ideas that come to you about things you should do. So you can write that down in a notebook or electronically. I use OneNote myself for a lot of this kind of stuff. But what I'm saying won't be on the final. There is no final, actually. Well, that's not entirely true. The final is your customers who are judging your final, and they don't care what I say at all. So it's not about what I'm saying. It's about what it inspires you to do. We will start with a quiz, and this is the only quiz I'm going to give that I've ever given, actually. And the quiz is a fill in the blank, one question. The purpose of a business is to create blank. Think about that for a minute. What you think the purpose of any business is. What's it to create? And when I ask this, I typically get answers like it's to create value, it's to create change in the world, it's to create wealth, it's to create some good in the world. Steve Jobs is famous for saying he wanted to put a dent in the universe. Those are all great answers. They happen to be wrong answers, but they're great answers. The right answer comes from a guy named Peter Drucker, who in the 20th century basically put the study of management on the map. He worked with companies from General Motors to small startups. He worked with nonprofits. He worked with the Girl Scouts. And he said that the purpose of a business is to create a customer. If you don't create a customer, you may have a wonderful product, you may have a hobby, you may have a charity, but you don't have a business. And if you want to create value, good in the world, wealth, all those other things, you have to do it by creating a customer. And a customer is somebody that pays you. So when companies like Facebook and some of the other apps that you see talk about how many users they have, if the users aren't paying, they're not actually customers. In fact, it's been said of Facebook particularly, if you aren't paying for the product, you are the product. And that's indeed what Facebook does. It sells your attention, your eyeballs, your being there to their advertisers who pay them. They are their customers. So think about why people pay anybody for anything. Think about the last thing you bought. Maybe it was earlier today. Maybe you bought lunch. Maybe you bought a cup of coffee. Maybe you bought a big purchase like a computer or a piece of furniture or something like that. Uh, at that point, you gave somebody money and you got value in return. And at that point of that exchange, I'll go out on a limb and say you wanted that value more than you wanted that money. I was actually teaching this in a college course in Connecticut where I used to live. And somebody says they're not hearing. Um, I think I'm live here. So when
You
you
are
give,
live. We'll take care of it. No worries.
okay, so when you give money for value, you want that thing more than you want the money. And as I was teaching this that day, I had earlier that day, my water heater had gone out and I had replaced it. And so I knew for a fact that I wanted hot water more than I wanted several $100s. That was just a very visceral lesson to me of that. But your customers are paying you for something. The interesting thing is, you don't always know the value as they see it. So the first thing to do about CEO thinking, the first rule of CEO thinking is we don't talk about, oh, wait a minute, that's Fight Club. Sorry about that. The first rule is look at the value as your customer defines it. And you'll think, well, what does that mean? If you think about the example of somebody a contractor who works on people's homes, maybe a plumber comes to fix things, or somebody's coming to build a room or remodel a kitchen. One of the biggest complaints about contractors is they don't show up when they say they'll be there. They come late and don't call. It's not about the product. It's not about the value. It's about the timeliness and the communication. That's what people value most. And sometimes people will be willing to pay a little more to get some of those other things that are part of the value of the money exchange. So what I'm encouraging you to do is think about it through the eyes of your customers. Obviously, if you're a contractor, you have to do good work, but you also have to show up. You have to be on time. You have to be communicating. And maybe your customers value other things than what you think you sell. Many professionals, lawyers and accountants and such, they charge by the hour. They think they're selling time, but nobody pays for time. People pay for their expertise. People pay for their wisdom. I have a client who's a CPA, and her CPA firm, they actually asked their clients, why do you value us? Why did you choose us? What do you like about us? And the answers that came back were not about their professionalism or their accuracy or their ability to save on taxes, which is all things they do. The answers that came back were, you guys are fun. You're lighthearted. You speak English instead of business. Those are the things that their customers value. So in order to see the value through your customers' eyes, I encourage you to ask them, to have a phone call or two with some of them and say, why did you choose us? And that will bring you to seeing the value of as your customers see it. The second thing about CEO thinking is to realize that you are not your company. When we start companies, and I've done this myself, we all do this, we feel like it's our baby. We feel like it's just the most precious thing. We put everything we have into it. But if you think about the CEO of a large public organization, they didn't found it. They're not there forever, most of them. Many of them are just there for 5 or 10 years, and then they move on, and maybe they work for another company. They see it as distinct. So they see this distinction. And what I would encourage you to do is to try to separate yourself a little bit emotionally, financially, and schedule-wise from your company, because not everything your company does is going to be perfect. Unlike your baby. I'm sure your baby is actually perfect, but not everything your company does. And if you want your company to improve, you have to say, oh, well, something is wrong here, or something could be better. And so that emotional distance will help you see that and improve the company. And two examples of that is, one is when you start out, as soon as you can, you should separate your finances from the company. You should have a separate company bank account, and your personal and family money should be separate. And secondly, you should separate your schedule. You should know at any given time, am I on the clock or not? Now, you don't have to officially check in because you're the boss, but you should know if you're working or not. There's a tendency with entrepreneurs and business owners is to be on the clock 24/7. And yes, we're always thinking about the company. We always bear the responsibility for our company, but you need time away. You need to say, this is when I'm not working, this is when I am working. Because I'll tell you something, there's always going to be more work to do. And so you might as well have some time when you decompress, take time for yourself, take care of yourself. And you should know when that is. Now, many of us don't work a regular set of hours. Sometimes you may work, you may get up in the morning before your family and do a couple hours worth of work then. Then you get with family, have breakfast, get everybody on their day. Then you work some more for a little bit. After people go to bed, you may work a couple hours in the evening. But if you think about that time frame, during the day, there's times when you're working, there's times when you're not. That should be clear, at least in your mind. And the reason you want that to be clear is because you, as I said, you and your company are separate. You give things to your company. You give it energy, you give it effort, you give it expertise, and probably at the beginning you gave it money. And it's going to give some things to you. It hopefully will give you more money than you gave it. It's going to give you a place to work, a community to be around, an identity in the world. Some people want their company to give them a legacy. There's all kinds of things people want from their companies. And if you and your company aren't separate, it's hard to get that. So that's number two. You are not your company. And the thing to think about is the company, there's only three things that every company has to do. They have to make something, which means they have to provide some value that somebody wants to pay for. Then they have to find those people and sell to it. And then they have to support the making and the selling. And usually as the support happens, as the company grows, that becomes a separate organization, or a separate part of the organization anyway. So when it's at the beginning, it's just you, but as it grows, you'll have people doing the making, selling, and the supporting. But as I said at the beginning, it's just you. And you may feel like this guy, when it's just you, you're doing everything yourself. You're making all the music, playing all the instruments, etc. But as your company grows, it's going to look like this. There's going to be people who have specialized expertise that are deeper than any one person, but it's more narrow because you have specialization. There's one person on this stage who's very interesting, and that's this person right here. The conductor doesn't make any of the music that people came to hear. The conductor is listening to everybody else that's doing it, and they're keeping everybody in balance. They're making sure that everybody's on the same tempo, They're making sure that everybody's in the same key, etc. They're coordinating everything, but they're not actually producing anything themselves. And so I want you to think of the CEO as the conductor. So what that means is you, in your role as CEO, you are pulling together all the efforts of everything else that goes on in the organization. You're pulling together the making, the selling, the support. You're keeping it in balance. One of the things that that balance means is that you're making the things that people can sell or that you can sell to people, and you're selling the things that people make. You'll actually, that sounds kind of obvious in a small company, but you'll find in big companies that they often don't, because they're so different organizations do the selling and the making, and they're often not even talking to each other. But that's where the conductor has to pull it all together. But if you're the conductor, then who plays the music, especially if it's a very small firm? Well, the truth is you are the conductor and you're the musician. But when you do that, you're wearing different hats. You're wearing one hat as the conductor and different hats as the musician. So what I mean by that is you're actually wearing maybe a hat to make the value that people want to buy. You're wearing a different hat to do the selling. You're wearing a different hat to do the supporting. And by supporting, I mean some of the office work, paying the bills, maybe tweaking the website, handling that kind of stuff. So are we talking about music? Are we talking about hats? Are we talking about jobs? What are we talking about here? Because in small companies, lots of people wear lots of hats. And we're actually, the best way to think about it is as a function. So each piece in your organization should be a function that produces some kind of output. So one of the functions that's the simplest to see this illustration about is the payroll function. So the trigger of payroll is maybe every 2 weeks. It's every other Wednesday. The input then is we put in how many people's hours, what their wages are, what their deductions are, etc. The transformation is all the calculations that the payroll company does, and the output is the money that comes out, goes into people's bank accounts, and the forms that go to the government, etc. So that's a function. And in a business, there's lots of functions. There's a lot of functions around the different parts of making the product or the service that you sell. There's parts of selling. There's the marketing part. There's doing the deals. There's closing the leads, etc. And there's a lot of different functions for the supports. And even if they are different people doing those functions, or if it's the same person, if it's just you doing all those functions have a different output. And that's why it's important and very useful to think about the different functions that produce different outputs. So you have functions, like I said, around making, selling, and supporting. And especially when it's just you or just you and a small team, it's really useful to use this tool that I'm going to show you to segregate when you're doing each function. And that tool is a very simple one. It's called a calendar. You take a weekly calendar is a great way to start, and you block out when you're going to do different kinds of work, when you're going to perform the different functions of making, selling, and supporting. And this is called time blocking. Rather than going to work and say, I'm going to handle whatever shows up, or I'm going to handle whatever's on my to-do list, you plan ahead of time. Oh, this is the time that I'm going to do my, in this instance, this person is doing a little bit of support work every morning, and then making and selling throughout the day, and then doing some support work at the end of the day. You can do it however works for you. But what I suggest you think about is when you show up for work, if you have a paying client and you need to make or provide a service for them, do that. When you don't have those clients, then you go into selling mode, and only very little bit of your time should be the support time. Otherwise, it's very tempting, especially if you don't love selling, which most people don't actually. It's very tempting to say, oh, well, I need to tweak my website one more time, or I need to clean up my files, or I need to go do this. And you're doing support work that is taking way much more time than it should. The other thing I suggest when you do this time blocking is that you leave some white space. You don't block out every minute of every day because stuff's going to happen. You want to be able to react to things that you couldn't plan, um, and to be able to function that way without having something unexpected throw your whole week off. And sometimes those unexpected things are really great things. Sometimes they're unfortunate things, but those are, you want to have some white space in your day. So that's the fourth piece of CEO thinking, which is to think about all the things that go on in your company as functions and not jobs. And each function then has an output. The reason that that's useful is as the company grows, you'll be hiring people to perform some of those functions, whereas now you're doing it. The output should be very similar, or at least it should improve perhaps, and not always be the same. But if you don't think of them as functions, it's hard to give it up. And entrepreneurs have a tendency, they have a reputation of being control freaks. I don't think that's always true. I think what mostly entrepreneurs are is intuitive, and they're really good about intuiting what's going on, but they're not very procedural. And it's hard to hand that off to somebody else. But if you think about it as a function that has an output, here's the recipe of what it takes to produce that output. It's easier to do. So here's a picture of what I just said, that the CEO is the owner, is the conductor, coordinating the making, the selling, the supporting, even if it's you that's doing all or most or maybe even all of that other work. So here's a picture of a CEO. This is Jeff Bezos, CEO and founder of Amazon. He's also the richest person on the planet, not only today, but I think forever. I haven't actually done all the work for Rockefeller and some of those others with the inflation numbers, but I think Bezos is right up there. So one of the things I like to ask when I give a talk is, who here has less money than Jeff Bezos? And whenever I ask this question, everybody raises their hand. All that means is I've never asked this question when Jeff Bezos was in the room. Everybody I talk to has less money than him. But then I ask the next question, which is, who has less time than Jeff Bezos? And nobody has less time. Nobody has more time. We all have the same amount of time. And so when you look at the time that you're blocking out of your week, one of the things you want to add to that is time to be CEO. Time to work on your business, not in your business. We've all heard that expression. Everybody, you need to work on your business. And then sometimes people say, and not in your business. Well, I don't think that part's true. You need to work in your business too. That's the part where you're playing the music, where you're doing the making, doing the selling. But you also have to have time to work on your business. I actually recommend that you spend 2 hours a week on your business. You can do it whenever you want, whenever 2 hours makes sense for you. Some people like to do it at the beginning of the week, sometime at the end of the week, some in the middle. Some people do it Sunday before they go to work, whatever. I would just suggest that you put it on your calendar, you block it off, you make it an appointment that you keep with yourself. And I'll tell you in a minute what you do during that CEO time. But I want to illustrate it with an example first. Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of England during the Second World War, was famous for taking naps in the middle of the day. And he would say, I'm going to take a nap now. I don't want to be disturbed unless there's an emergency. And I further define emergency by the building being on fire or the armed invasion of the British Isles. That's how important that nap was to him. Now, I'm not suggesting you take naps. That's up to you. What I am suggesting is you put that much importance into your CEO time, that you make that something that is involatile, something that will not change, and do it at the same time every week. A lot of people get some benefit from doing it also in a different place. Now, that's interesting thing to say in the midst of a pandemic when we can't go to so many places. But if you can get away, or at least sometimes even change rooms, or just do a different part of your house if you're working at home, and that change in environment gets your mental attitude to be different as well. You'll notice that this person here on Friday afternoons changed one of his support days to a little bit of having a beer. That's not required. That's up to you. I'm not sure I'd recommend that if you do your CEO time first thing Monday morning either, but that's up to you. So what do you do with the CEO time? Well, you may have seen this diagram before. This is called the Eisenhower matrix. It was made popular. Dwight Eisenhower actually, I think, invented it or documented it first, but it was made popular by Stephen Covey. It's in a couple of his books. And that is, some of the things that we have to do are important and some are not important. Some are urgent and some are not urgent. And they connect in this way. So you have things that are urgent and important, not urgent and important, urgent and not important, and then not urgent and not important. And your CEO time falls into the second category. It's a quadrant that is important but not urgent. What that means is it doesn't have to be done today. It could be done tomorrow, it could be done next week, but if you never do it, then those important things that are in your mind, that vision that you have, will never get translated into the real world. So that's why you want to block out your CEO time and only do things that are not urgent but important during those 2 hours. One of the ways to think about what's urgent and what's important is things that are urgent means the deadline is set by somebody else. If somebody else is setting the deadline, then it's probably in the urgent column and not this second column. So that's one thing to think about. What I recommend is that you get a notebook that's just for your CEO stuff. It's your CEO notebook. If you like writing on paper with a nice pen and maybe a leather-bound book or something like that, get one of those. If you want to do something electronic, I actually use OneNote. It's a free software that works on, I think, every platform that there is. I find that very useful because my handwriting is absolutely terrible. But whatever you like to do, get a notebook, put your notes in there, and just get the things out of your head onto paper. And some of them you'll end up doing those things. Do not take phone calls. Do not take emails when you're doing your CEO time, because that's opening the door for somebody else to set your agenda. Now, it's okay sometimes to make phone calls or to write emails, but don't have them come back at you. You might be thinking about people that you want to start a relationship with, a business relationship. Those you could reach out to during your CEO time. You might be thinking about ways that you can help some of your employees or change productivity, or think about new software or new tools that you could use. Those are some ideas that you put down in your CEO time. Don't expect that all your ideas are good ones. Somebody once said the way to have a lot of good ideas is to have a lot of bad ideas, because the more ideas you have, the more likely some of them will be good. Which is why I encourage you, when you do write in your notebook, to put the date down every time, because you'll be able to go back and you go, oh, wait, that was stupid. I thought that was, 6 months ago, that's what I thought. That was dumb. The other reason to date it is that you'll look back and you'll go, wow, I've really come a long way. 6 months ago, I was really worried about this, or I didn't know how to do that, and I was making notes about that. And now it's just second nature to me. I'm really good at it, or I've really accomplished this, or whatever. And as business owners and CEOs, it's really good for us to recognize where we come from, where we've been, how much we've accomplished, because we often are spending most of our time solving problems, which is why we get paid the big bucks, but it's good to look back at the victories as well. So get a CEO notebook. And one of the things that I encourage people to do with their CEO time is to think about their business model. And here's what I mean by the business model. The business model is how you make money. So it's not the product that you make, but it's how you package and sell the product. So I'll give you an example. As I said before, a lot of professionals offer their time and they charge by the hour, but others are charging a flat fee. Well, that's a different business model. Same advice, but a different way of packaging it and pricing it. software is sold in many different business models now. You can get software for free, and it usually comes with ads. So that's one business model. You can buy software on a subscription basis where you pay every month or every year, and when you stop paying, you can't use the software anymore. That's a different business model. Software, mostly now for big organizations, is charged up front, a large amount, and then a smaller amount every year for upgrades. That's called the enterprise model. That's a different business model. The way that a business model makes sense and how you know about it is this formula here: LTV minus CA times N equals money. Now, this is not an actual mathematical formula, but it's a useful way of thinking about it. Here's what that means. LTV is the lifetime value of a customer. CA is the cost of acquiring that customer, and N is having the right number of customers that balance your ability to sell, to acquire customers, and your ability to serve them. Back in the day when Netflix was just doing DVDs, and they didn't have streaming, they didn't have original content that they were providing. They actually have lots of people that are still getting the DVD subscription. But you'd pay $6 or $7 a month. I can't remember the exact amount. But back then, the reason I can say this is because they actually published these numbers. And it cost them an average of about $40 to acquire a new customer between ads and the promotions and other things that they were doing. So their cost of acquiring a new customer was $40. That person was paying them, let's say, $7 a month. And then they had to provide, there was a cost of licensing those DVDs, providing the DVDs, mailing them out, etc. So the lifetime value depended on how long somebody stayed with them. And it turned out that the average Netflix subscriber back then was staying about 2.5 years. So it was well worth it for them to spend $40 to get this person who was going to have that much of a lifetime value. You can look into your numbers and say, what is the lifetime value of a typical customer? Now, obviously, that depends on what you sell and who your customers are. Some sales, you pretty much only make them once. Some sales, you can make them over and over again. And you've probably heard it said that it's cheaper to sell more things to the same customers than it is to get a new customer. And that's because with a new customer, you have to invest this cost of acquisition every time. But for an old customer, you don't. So if you can increase the lifetime value, then your business model makes more sense. So the lifetime value is what a customer pays minus what it costs you to provide the value that they pay for, minus how long or how many times they do that. That's their lifetime value. The cost of acquisition is you can total up, let's say for a year or for 6 months, all of your costs associated with marketing and sales, and divide that by the number of customers or the number of sales that you make, and that's your cost of acquisition. And then the N is the number of customers that balances your ability to sell with your capacity to serve those customers. Because you don't want to waste time, money, and effort selling customers that you can't provide the value for. And likewise, you don't want to make a whole lot of product, have it sitting on the shelf if you can't sell it. So the N in there is the balance. And so this is how you make money. And you can think about in your CEO time, you can do some of those calculations and say, when am I doing this? How am I making money? I had a crazy business for 25 years, actually, much longer than any of us thought it would last. I sold movie libraries to apartments, and the apartments used it as a marketing tool. They said, we would sell them, let's say 50 movies. We would lease them, actually, 50 movies. And if you rented the apartment, you could borrow the movies overnight for free. Every month, we would change the movies out. We would send them a whole new batch, and they would send the old ones back. This was Netflix before Netflix was Netflix. And nobody thought it would last as long as it ended up doing. But my point was, I didn't realize at the beginning how valuable my customers were. And so as a result, I was a little hesitant to spend money getting new ones. And after I'd been in business for a while and I started looking at how long customers stayed with me and how valuable they were, I thought, wow, I can spend a lot more on marketing and sales because it's worth it to acquire new customers. So that changed everything for me. I really buffed up the marketing and improved the sales at that point. So just knowing this model, this formula, how that works for you is great use of your CEO time. So I want to summarize where we're at so far. CEO thinking is seeing the value as your customer defines it, knowing that you and your company are separate emotionally, physically, financially, knowing that you function as the CEO, even if you are also the musicians, and to look at the things that happen in your company as functions, not jobs, and then to schedule CEO time. I put this one in red because that's the most important. If you'll do that one first, then you'll have time to do some of these others because, again, they're important, but they're not urgent. So to summarize, this guy is not a CEO. The reason I can tell that is because he may be thinking like one, but that's all he's doing. He's been there for 100 years, sitting there in the same place, thinking and not doing anything. As a CEO, yes, you have to think like a CEO, but you also have to move and do things. And so this slide summarizes the thinking and the actions. See the value as your customers define it. The action associated with that is block out some time to call them and say, why did you choose us? What do you like about us? What do you value about what we do? And when you do that, my encouragement is that you write down their exact words, their exact language. Because if you see patterns, if you see them all typically saying the same words, that's actually your marketing message. And so you should then use those words in your marketing. You are not your company. So the action that goes along with that is separate your finances, separate your schedule from your business. Know when money's going in and out of the business. Know when you're working, when you're not working. As CEO, you're the conductor. Use time blocking to block out when you're doing the musician work, the making, the selling, the support, and also when you're doing CEO time, which is the last one as well. And then think about functions, not jobs. Each function has an output. So one of the things you can do in your CEO time is document the output that you expect from the making time, the selling time, and the support time. Even if it's you that's doing all that output, document what you expect from yourself and be your own manager. And then, of course, schedule the CEO time. And like I said, I suggest 2 hours a week with a CEO notebook. So that wraps up what I have to share. If you'd like a copy of this, please go ahead and email me, John at ceobootcamp.com, and I'll be happy to take questions at this point.
Awesome. First, I'd love to give space for the people in the studio, and we are only able to accommodate a very limited amount of people in the studio to ask questions. So Vicky, Austin, Lisa, Alex, if you guys have any questions, please let me know and I'll put you in. In the meantime, I want to kick us off with one question we got, which I can relate to very deeply. How do you separate yourself from your business? I've invested my life savings into it.
The first step is to realize that it's a physically and should be legally a separate entity. If you've actually become an LLC or a nonprofit corporation, et cetera, then it's legally a separate entity. This doesn't mean that you're not passionate about it. That it doesn't mean that you're not tied up about it. But it means that you can take a detached look at it and say, this is what needs to be improved in the business, and you don't feel threatened by that. And it's also a way of, like I said, separating your personal finances from the business. You have invested your money in the business, but it should be paying you back at some point. And so you want to keep those separate accounts at least. You want to have a separate bank account for your finances, your personal finances and your business finances. And so at least you know when the business needs more money, if you decide to put it in, you actually have a conscious decision. Oh, I have moved money from this account to that account. And the other thing is to know when you're working and when you're not working. I joke often that as entrepreneurs, we can work any 80 hours a week that we choose. Uh, but there's more than 80 hours a week in a week, actually. And so there's times we need to sleep, there's times we need to eat, there's times we need to decompress. And you should know when you're working, when you're not. Even if you're working a lot, there's times when you just have to say, I'm done. Because you can't say, I'm going to work till it's finished. It will never be finished.
Mm-hmm.
You have to pull the plug sometimes and just decompress.
So
And
what
then
advice?
keep a notebook in the shower because you're going to get ideas all the time, and write them down.
This
Go
ideas
ahead.
come in the power for sure. So what advice do you give to entrepreneurs that struggle pulling the plug?
Pulling the plug how?
So that struggle just calling it a day.
At the end of the day, you mean?
Yeah.
Um, I would say use that calendar. Think through ahead of time when it makes sense for you to work and when it makes sense for you not to work, and then hold yourself to it. And I was doing sharing something very similar to this. A woman said, "Well, I have a full time job, and my business is my side gig." And well, that's great. That just means there's 40 hours a week at your full time job when you can't work on your business. So you have to block those out. Then the time that you do have, that you're not sleeping, that you're not eating, that you're not dealing with your family, whatever time you have, that's your work time, and you have to turn it off. You're never going to turn it off completely, which is why one of the frustrations actually that business owners have sometimes with employees is we think, well, they just don't think like a business owner. And my answer to that is that's true. If they did, they probably wouldn't work for you. They'd be your competitor. Uh, Employees, they want to be able to go home and turn it off. We can't always turn it off completely, but at least we can say, I'm not working at this time. Um, if it helps you, keep your CEO notebook with you. Let's say you're just eating dinner or watching TV or something like that, and you get a business idea, write it down so you don't have to think about it anymore. You say, I'll get to that in the morning when I do my work, or I'll get to that, Friday afternoon when it's CEO time. Now I've got it captured in this notebook or in this place that I can go back to. That may
Awesome.
help.
So here's another one. How do you know if you have a business plan that is viable long term?
It goes back to the business model. If the cost of acquiring a customer is more than the lifetime value of that customer, you don't have a viable business. If it costs you more to get a customer than they actually pay in profits, then you need to change something. You need to increase your prices. You need to decrease your costs. You need to be able to sell more efficiently or something. But when you have that uh, efficient business model where the cost of acquiring a customer is less than the lifetime value, then you can scale that up and ramp that up.
Awesome. And we have a question from someone in the studio. Sales and marketing is my main pain point. Any ideas?
Most people don't love sales and marketing, but it has to be done until you can hire somebody that does love it. The other part of it is to break out the marketing piece from the sales piece. And that depends on the nature of what you sell and the nature of how people buy. One of the cop outs that I've seen recently is there's so much that gets sold on the internet, and that's true. That's because people want to buy it on the internet. But there's a lot of selling that doesn't happen on the internet. And sometimes people just say, well, what's the right Facebook group for me to join so I get all this business? What's the right sales funnel for me to put on my website so I get all this business? What they're really saying is, I don't want to talk to anybody. I just want to put something out there and have the sales come in magically. And if that's how your customers will buy, then that's great. It's not easy and it's not cheap to do that well, but most of us have to sell face to face. We may do our marketing by the internet, but we'll get our leads, and then we actually have to talk to people, and we have to convince them that we can solve their problems, and it's worth paying us for the value that we provide.
John, have you learned different things from different businesses? What might be the lessons that each type of business taught you, if you had to summarize one per business?
Well, there's so many different business models. One of them is this in the service business where you are providing expertise, wisdom, and experience for people. The limiting factor of your ability to make and provide value is your time. Because if you're giving time to people, they're not actually buying your time, they're buying your expertise, but you can only give it in a limited amount of time. So you want to adapt your business model to that reality, which means be really good at what you do, and then you can afford to charge a lot and find people that only want to that are happy to pay that amount. Now, that's different than if you're in a mission driven business like a nonprofit where you're serving people who by definition don't have a lot of money. Well, then you want to get people who to support you who do want to spend the money to have you support them. So it really depends on your business model. I think one of the biggest lessons I would say, particularly for entrepreneurs starting out, there's this tendency to think that if I lower my price, I will sell more. And that's often not the case because price has a signaling factor to it. And higher priced things usually have more value or are perceived to have more value. And so it's harder to make money at a lower price point. So I would suggest to people that they don't lower their price until they figured out why they can't sell at that price that they're selling at. And often it's because they're not as good a salesperson as they need to be, and they can improve that. That's a learnable skill.
And what about for you personally, from the businesses that you have operated, what have been the different lessons?
The biggest lesson for me came early on in this video business I was telling you about. One of the other weird things about that business was I lived in Texas when I started it, and 2 years later it was kind of getting on its feet, and I wanted to move back to the Northeast because that's where I'm from and for lifestyle reasons. But the business didn't make sense to move, so I kept the business in Texas, and I was kind of running it long distance. And literally, this was before the internet, and so literally they would overnight me data tapes so I could put it in my computer and see what was going on, et cetera. And the lesson for me was I was very, very frustrated that my employees didn't think about the business the way I did. I said this before, they didn't think like an entrepreneur. And I was hitting my head against the wall until I realized, oh, if they thought like me, they probably wouldn't work for me. And so the lesson was to appreciate people for what they do, not be frustrated for what they don't do. And that changed things around quite a bit for me. That was one of them.
Awesome. John, what are some examples of costs for signing on new customers besides marketing?
Well, the marketing is the cost that you generate usually to get leads. So to get somebody interested, or to get somebody to know about you. But once they know about you, then what? So depending on the kind of business you're in, some people, like I said, there are lots of businesses and more, particularly when you're selling to consumers, you're selling a product where they'll actually purchase right on the website. So once you've got the leads, then you don't have to spend a whole lot more. But there's other businesses where you have to do proposals. That's a cost. Where you have to maybe pay a salesperson commission. That's a cost. If you have to do a revenue share or affiliate marketing, that's a cost. So there's a lot that goes into that, but again, it varies by the business. Another thing that entrepreneurs tend to not realize, especially early on, is the value of their time. If you have to spend time talking to somebody, once you've done some marketing, they click on your website, they say, I'm interested, let's talk about this, I'm not ready to buy yet. And you have to spend time talking to them and explaining to them what you do and how much it costs, and maybe getting them to sign a contract or pay a credit card fee or whatever. That time is valuable. And you may think, well, my time is free, but your time is not unlimited, as we saw with the Jeff Bezos example. So as you expand your company, you're going to have to pay somebody to spend that time. And you should be thinking about your remuneration as time, as being paid for that time as well.
How should you price your time?
You shouldn't price your time. You should price the value of what you provide to the customer. Um, when you're calculating your time in these different functions that you do, you basically look out to the marketplace and say, if I had to hire somebody to do what I'm doing, what would it cost? Now, then you think, well, nobody's going to do all the different things I'm doing. Well, that's true. That's where you break it down into a function. You say, let's say I'm some kind of professional, a psychologist, a lawyer, or whatever, and I spend 50% of my time dealing with clients. That's the providing the value piece. You could look around and say, what does it cost to get somebody of my ability to provide that professional service full time? And then you say, well, I'm only doing it half time. So that value of my time is half of that. And then I'm spending 30% of my time selling. Well, what would it cost to get a salesperson to do that? Well, and then you take that number, divide by 30%. That's the value of my sales time. Then I spend 10% of my time bookkeeping and doing stuff around the office. What would it cost to get a bookkeeper? And what's 10% of that? And that way you can assign the cost to your time. It's not the same as the value or the price, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I got you. So
If you mean how do you price your service or your product to the customer, that's a different calculation. So there's basically three ways to do that. One is when this is typical in government contracts, it's called cost plus. You figure out what it costs you to provide that service or that product. You add on a little, a certain amount for overhead and profit, et cetera. And so it's from your cost up. The other way is competitive pricing. If you're providing a product that's very similar to what everybody else provides, you basically have to provide the same price or people aren't going to buy from you. So if you go to Home Depot and you buy some things, you could buy the same thing pretty much at Lowe's. It's going to be about the same price because they have to. The best way to price is if you can it's called value pricing. Talk about the value that you provide to your customer and price just a little bit below that. So if you're worth, $1 million to somebody, well, even if it only costs you 100 to make it, they will pay a lot more than 100 because it's worth $1 million to them. I'm exaggerating, of course, but you get the idea.
I got you. So what is the number one reason people come to you?
Frustration. The people that come to me are entrepreneurs, they're business owners, they're usually very smart people. The connection between their problems and the obvious solutions they've already figured out. But there's problems or there's frustration that they have that things aren't growing as fast as they could. They're frustrated with either their current employees or their ability to get new employees. They're frustrated with how much money they're making or not making. It's something in that they're frustrated with that they have already figured out the simple solutions and those aren't working either. And so the first thing I do is I say, well, what do you want from the business? I take those two circles. Your company's over here, you're over here. What do you want it to give you? And I have a whole sheet of about 25 different things that people have told me. Obviously, money's a part of a few of them, but it's not the entire picture. And then I say, let's look at all the different functions in your company, all the making functions, selling functions, support functions, see how they're doing, see which ones are broken. And in light of trying to provide you the kind of company that will give you what you want, where do we go from here?
Awesome. I also ask people to write the things that take away energy
Mm-hmm.
and that give them energy, so that the ones that are on the red zone can be given away faster. Now, let's say that
Right.
you you do that exercise, and you discover that the bulk of your business is in red. Um, what what do you recommend? Is that a good time to bring in someone else to run your company? Is that a good time to?
Um, I would look at it in two ways. One is I would say, regardless of whether it's red for me, does the company need it to be done? And if
Mhm,
it doesn't, then you can just eliminate it and it goes away. But if it does need to be done, is it the kind of thing that I can do anyway, even though it's red, or is it the kind of thing that I do need to bring somebody in, either to do that part or to do the whole thing? It's quite possible to be an owner of a company and not run it. If there's Then the other side of it is I would look at the things that are green, which is what I assume is the opposite of red.
mhm,
What are the things you love to do, and how can you structure the organization so that the company gets what it needs and you still are doing mostly what you love to do? You're never going to do 100% green. That's
mhm.
just not the real world. But we've all got to take out the garbage someday. um, but can you get somebody to do the things that the company needs? And that's why it's important to separate yourself from the organization too.
Right, right. I was recently speaking with an entrepreneur that's really passionate about childhood diabetes, and rather ending childhood diabetes.
Hmm.
Um, and they had a lot of content, nutrition content, and what they were passionate about was creating the recipes. But what they hated, and what was integral to making their business a success, was actually disseminating that information and sharing it.
Right.
So the bulk of the business was in red, but it was all for the purpose of disseminating information to end childhood diabetes. Um, Now, if that is a business that, let's say, she's waiting to have a certain amount of followership and membership to be able to maybe drop some of the outreach, is that a business that you would say is well suited for the individual and should be continued until they get to that place? Or
I would take a step back and say, who's the customer of this business? In other words, who is willing to pay for those recipes for this kind of thing? And have they talked to enough of those people to find out how to provide those recipes in a way that's valuable to the customer? Now, in some cases, when you're dealing with health, it may be that the person who's sick is actually not the customer. Maybe it's the hospital. Maybe it's the insurance company. Maybe it's the doctors who are, or in America these days, it's usually the insurance company who's willing to pay for this so that those people get better. Um, and so that may be who your customer is, even though your user or the ultimate beneficiary of that work is not the customer. So I would go back a step and say, who is willing to pay for this? And if nobody is, then it's not a business. It might be a great hobby. It might be a great website to put this stuff out there and just have people take it. But if they're not willing to pay for it, then it's not really a business. The other thing is I get very nervous when people talk to me, when entrepreneurs talk to me about their passion, because a mission driven business, the passion of a mission can sometimes blind you to the business aspect of it. And if you are actually in a business and you don't make money and you can't sell, then you can't be around for very long.
mhm.
So what I say to people is, it's not about following your passion, it's about following your customer's passion. And if you haven't found those customers with with the passion for what you sell, then that's what needs to be done first.
Awesome. So one more question, John. Are there natural traits to being an entrepreneur, or can you become a CEO entrepreneur?
I know there are not natural traits to being a leader. Leaders come in all kinds of personality. And you started off this discussion talking about leadership. Um, Leaders there's charismatic leaders, there's boring leaders, there's exciting leaders, there's introverted leaders, extroverted leaders. Leaders have two things in common. They have a vision and they repeat that vision, they express that vision, they share that vision in a way that inspires people, and they do it over and over and over again. Uh, as far as CEOs or business owners, I don't know the answer. I've only seen one study that said uh, there was a group out of Colorado that said they did have indications that certain personality types were better suited for entrepreneurship than others. But I think for the most part, I've worked with people of all kinds of different personalities, and it's just a matter of learning what you're good at, what you're not good at, how to do the things that you're not good at, even if you don't love them, enough so that the business can do it. Now, some people will do better at certain business models than others because of the parts that they love more and that they're good at more. But I think anybody can learn it if they're willing to take an honest look at what their needs are, what their abilities are, and what the business needs.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to connect with us. Do you have any final thoughts or pieces of advice?
Not advice so much as a final thought. I love being a business owner. I think it's the most wonderful thing in the world, and I know that it's not for everybody, and I'm glad that it's not for everybody because I wouldn't have had people to work for me if it was. But I think if you do it right and it's something that you're good at, it can be the most fun lifestyle that there is. So I would encourage everybody to learn about it and go for it that way.
John, actually, can I ask you one last question? And
Sure.
this one is coming from me. So there seems to be an obsession, and perhaps serial entrepreneurs is guilty of this as well, but an obsession with hustle, right? Of
Hmm.
like, if you work harder, if you put in more hours, if you sleep less, if you work Sunday, Saturday, then you can make it. Just push through, push through. And it feels like such an unhealthy narrative, one that is not sustainable, right? So when sometimes when I hear things like you can work the 80 hours you choose, right? Um, and I do think you can find enjoyment in your work, but I think there's something to be said about creating a more sustainable business, and not just sustainable monetarily, but sustainable mentally,
Hmm.
emotionally, family. How long did it take you to learn that you needed to do that? And how did you set the structure and discipline to really make time to separate yourself from your business and take care of yourself? Or was this something that you always knew you had to do?
No, that great question. So if I gave the impression that you should be working 80 hours a week, I apologize. That's not the point. There are certainly times in a business, and particularly when it's starting up, that you need to work hard and you need to work long. But if you have found the right business model and you have found the right scale of your company to where you can hire the people to do the things that need to be done, you can't do that forever. It ultimately is a marathon, not a sprint. And if I'm not a runner, but if I started out at the beginning of a marathon, I could beat any of those marathon runners for about 100 yards. And that's about it. you know, um, they would keep going and keep going, but they start off slow. So you do have to get to a point eventually where that happens. And then sometimes there will be emergencies come up. Sometimes they're good emergencies. Sometimes all of a sudden a customer gives you a great big order and you have to really bust your butt for a week or so um, to get that out the door. But if that's constant, then something's wrong. Either your business model's wrong, the way you're doing it's wrong, et cetera. So I do think grit is a good, and this is one of the things I liked about what you told me about street entrepreneurs from the first time we talked. It does take grit, but it doesn't take that grit doesn't mean it has to wear you down. You have to be scrappy. You do have to hustle, but you don't have to wear yourself out doing that. And if that's the case, then you're not doing it right. And maybe you're too tied up in the emotion of it, and you haven't been able to separate yourself and look for the smarter ways to work rather than the harder ways to work. It takes grit to work smarter, um, but it's not the same as working harder at the same things that don't produce the results.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you registered for this workshop, we'll also be sharing with you the PowerPoint and the presentation, and you can also write John right here. John, it seems like what you do is a lot for sure. Business coaching, but also life coaching is what I'm sensing.
Well, I'll tell you, when I got when somebody first told me about coaching, which, other than sports, I had never heard of it in this way. This was in the mid 90s. It hadn't become a buzzword yet, but I talked to more than one individual who said, I, I was doing, either consulting or CPA work or something, and my clients started asking me these deeper, life-changing questions, and I started helping them, and I didn't know what to call it, and I came out with the term coaching. So your business and your life are intertwined. So you have to have the answers are intertwined as well. You can't separate them entirely.
Yeah, and I also think the key lies in creating a business model that works for you.
Yes.
And for the lifestyle you want to lead, and that goes beyond the amount of money you want to make. Like if you want to have time on the weekends and you're thinking of starting a restaurant,
Right. Exactly.
you might want to think again, right?
Uh-huh. Indeed. Indeed.
So
And what you need changes as you grow. When you're single, and you're able to move a lot and you don't have a lot of financial commitments, the things you need to support that lifestyle might be different than when you have kids or when you have houses and other things as well. So, yeah.
awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. And if you're in the studio, you can stay with us so we can chat privately.
All right. Well,